And I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dallen Webster. Dallen is a resource engineer with Barr Engineering. I'll turn the time over to Dallen.
Awesome. Thanks, Alec. All right, so like Alex said, Dallen here, I'm a water resources engineer, so that's mainly what I do day to day with the Barr Engineering Group. So today we're gonna take a look at some climate resiliency tools, different applications for addressing some climate hazards that we're experiencing in the Intermountain West and beyond. So first off, when you think about climate change, which song maybe comes to your mind? Is it The End of the World as We Know It? Are you more on the Cruel Summer train? We Can Work It Out, maybe a little bit more optimistic? Or Sunshine, Lollipops, and Rainbows? So, wherever you stand, hopefully this presentation will change it more in an optimistic view. So a little bit of the agenda, we're going to start out just looking at climate adaptation in the West and what that means, some climate change vulnerability assessment work for planning purposes, and then some different toolbox applications for some real-life projects that can maybe help some of those problems that you plan for in those assessments. So I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on the climate change issue and the risks involved, but just talking about Intermountain West specifically and some of the issues that we encounter here. Water stress is a big one. Changes in our climate and trends in different precipitation patterns and changing hydrology have widespread impacts. Also issues like wildfires and the effects that it can have on our watersheds and water quality can really have large spread impacts and can have a lot of costs associated with to solve these kinds of problems. So changing precipitation patterns, drought, more intense heat at different parts of the year, it's kind of different themes that people have been talking about today. And then, of course, increased costs. So this is a pretty busy graph here, but the general gist is, a lot of these kind of big impacts are starting to have a lot greater costs on our communities, and government organizations and other folks are having to invest more money to solve these kinds of problems. So the more effort we can put in now, save some of those costs maybe later on down the line. So, all right, so before we get into some of these adaptation plans and planning efforts, I wanted to define a few things. So when we're talking about vulnerability, you can think about it like a sensitivity analysis or regarding certain populations in the community or a state or maybe and even a county. So talking about your populations and how vulnerable they are to different hazards and how sensitive they are. So a good metaphor for that might be if you're going into a blizzard wearing like a windbreaker versus if you go in wearing like a parka, like a winter parka. You're going to be more or less vulnerable to these kinds of these hazards. And then the hazards themselves, the main thing to mention is they're either human-induced or natural. And then another big part about that is the trend. So it might not just be a singular event like a blizzard or like a tsunami or any of these other climate-induced effects. It could be like a trend, like I mentioned earlier, with precipitation trends changing in the state of Utah and the Intermountain West. It's important to remember that these trends can have big long-term impacts. And how that feeds into risk is these climate hazards, they create these risks because of the vulnerabilities. So tying those all together and feeding into our planning process. So we, of course, this is another busy graph. So if you want to take a picture of it, great. Otherwise, starting from the beginning, we need to identify those hazards. So I pointed some out earlier with the drought, different aspects of drought and changing precipitation, all these kinds of different risks and extreme events that are having different impacts on our communities and vulnerable populations. And then we kind of want to move into the second phase. So we're identifying features at risk. So these are different assets in the community that might be vulnerable, more or less vulnerable to certain impacts. So these could be infrastructure. So that could be your water supply infrastructure, your stormwater infrastructure, You could also be looking at your assets considering society and people, your communities, your different populations that enhance communities or strengthen different parts of that. And then obviously natural resources. So locally, the Great Salt Lake, that's a very strong resource that we want to protect, and looking at ways, there's a lot of planning efforts going on right now to mitigate some of those risks associated with these assets. So moving along, we need to associate how these hazards affect these risks, or how these hazards affect these assets, and kind of linking them together. So connecting those dots, and connecting that is important because they can either have a minimal effect or a pretty large effect depending on the asset you're trying to protect. And then list actions that you need to take in response. So as an engineer, this is maybe where I start to come in most often, is looking at specific things that we can use to solve these problems, different technologies, different key actions that we can start using. In terms of big infrastructure, making more resilient infrastructure in terms of like expanding reservoirs, maintaining pipe systems, all these kind of little things or large things that we need to kind of take action. So kind of adding that in a list. And then you're setting your priorities as the next step. So even if we have a list of all these things, what are we going to start funding first? What if we have federal funding or state funding, what can we start to allocate funds for now, working towards creating or completing this plan that we've built. So that's moving on to the last phase, developing this plan and actually executing it. So that's kind of what we're going to get into next, talking about some of these real-life planning examples. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I wanted to make a point, kind of going back to the identifying your assets. A lot of assets in a community or whatever kind of domain you're setting for your study, they can actually also be vulnerabilities too, so it's good to take that into account. So a hospital can be a really powerful asset to a community where people can go if they have medical needs, but also it can be a vulnerability in case of a climate disaster. So looking at different ways that different assets can either have vulnerabilities even though they have their strengths. So this is one example that we of a climate change action plan that we developed for a county in Minnesota. So they built out different, they wanted to look at some key areas to prioritize different funding mechanisms that they had. And one where you kind of start out with that in the planning process is looking at your assets in the community, so community centers, community gathering places, infrastructure, and then associating that with either vulnerable populations. So these are different data sets that you can start to bring into these analyses to prioritize funding. So the vulnerable populations, that's kind of gathered from census data, age, education, housing, different kind of mechanisms that you can kind of set different boundaries for determining your vulnerable populations. Then you kind of get a composite out of that to prioritize your funding. And then looking at more on the hazard side, this is where you start to bring in kind of your regional mapping of different risks or hazards. So, here's an example of some warming effects from heat island, and then some precipitation, flooding risks that may be associated with higher rates of precipitation from climate change. And then different aspects of ecological corridors and maintaining natural spaces and conservation areas. So kind of bringing this all together, and you can kind of see those initial areas, the vulnerable population areas, kind of overlaying that together. And you can kind of craft your own areas of prioritizing project funding or investing in these different project efforts. And then here's another brief example of a similar kind of project performed for the city of Cedar Falls, Iowa. This had a lot of similar data, all in GIS. GIS is a very powerful tool in this kind of planning process. So leveraging different data sets to all kind of compile it into one map that you can help prioritize these different investments is a really kind of big key. So, and also transferring that knowledge to any kind of grants or different groups that could actually fund these things. These can create powerful tools to showcase what you're investigating or what you're studying. So some little lessons learned, some big lessons learned. One big thing is kind of determining the scale of your study and seeing what may be nested inside. Are you looking at like a study from a county perspective? Or maybe like a larger watershed, a river basin, a state, kind of determining the domain for whatever study you're looking at. And that actually might expand into different opportunities for funding. So if you can bring in different project partners, you can start to think on that early on the planning process, and you may be eligible for different pools of funding. And then I think these two slides kind of hit a little bit of the same theme, making sure to account for undeveloped areas. Climate change is an evolving trend and an evolving process, so you want to make sure you plan for undeveloped areas or areas in your community or your kind of study domain that may change in the future and how that might impact your study. So just some lessons learned there. All right, so kind of back here, we've kind of more been in the planning process, looking at actions and setting priorities with these maps. So now we're going to move on towards actual like project applications and how we've started taking action on the ground. So one way we can do this is looking at adaptive reservoir operations. So actually looking at kind of altering the typical operations of reservoirs from how we've done it in the past of just having a kind of manual controls and actually bringing technology into that and predictive machine learning. So this was a project for the city of Edina in Minneapolis. From this graphic, you can see it was in a low area, so it already kind of managed a lot of natural runoff that filtered into this low area. You can see the site had a large forested area, and it had an existing stormwater detention feature in there. And then there was a small other detention feature here. And so what was the goal of the project was to use existing space in kind of a highly urban corridor that had already been developed and looking for ways to expand stormwater storage in cases of increased precipitation from these changing storm events that are becoming more intense, more frequent, and needing to have more adaptability for in this limited space. So that's kind of the resulting project there. You can see the pre-project before things had started to been altered. You can tell that the detention feature is a little bit maybe nutrient laden, maybe had some problems there, some problems with maintenance concerns from the city who managed this property. So some improvement could definitely be made from an original 1960 construction. So flood control was kind of the main purpose of the project, like I'd mentioned, changing precipitation. And so infrastructure needed to be added, some pipe, and then also some grading to account for the additional storage that was available in the basin. And then kind of my favorite part of the project, and a little bit unique to this, is these adaptive level control pumps. So there's two 4,500 GPM pumps that were brought and installed at kind of the outlet to this reservoir, and they allow for a drawdown of the lake to allow for additional storage in case of these storms. And all of that is linked to a radar model, a NOAA radar that can predict these storms and start drawing down the reservoir in advance of these storms, so you can actually have that additional storage that's ready. So day to day, that's kind of the operation of these pumps. It kind of draws down the little bit that infiltrates into the reservoir, so you have a little bit of slight fluctuation, but you have that kind of even water level in the lake. That's that normal cycle. And then in response to an upcoming storm that the system predicts looking at forecasts and radar, you can actually start to draw down, they'll draw down the lake just to a certain level that is accounted for in the forecast. And then when these precipitation events come in, you see a fill in on the lake. And the program is set up so you can actually have a hold pattern, so you don't just automatically dump the water back into the system downstream, but you'll actually hold on to some of that water and settle out some of the nutrients or particulates instead of having those just go downstream to the natural systems that could be impacted. So that holding pattern is pretty important. And then you can see here later on down the line, larger storm event, pretty significant compared to that one, was upcoming. So there was a dumping of the lake, so to speak, to prepare for that storm. So there's kind of what the lake looks like, again, from an aerial view. We've got, and a big component of this was habitat restoration. Those woodland areas were kind of infested with non-native species, which a big need for the project was to bring in more native plants and flora that could enhance the lake and provide for even just residents in the area to come and walk near. And there's something about a green space that's great. So I think that was really cool. And then there's just one more aerial view kind of that. So let's see. So the two more let's touch on, one being alternative filtration media. So I don't know if there's any chemistry nerds in here. I'm not going to go too deep, so don't get too excited. But this was a project to look at different medias in stormwater filtration. So from an urban watershed where you have a lot of pollutants in the rainwater runoff. And so this was a larger project site in Maplewood, Minnesota. And so there was a larger retrofit going on at the project site. And there were a number of these rain gardens that were established with that alternative media. So in this case, it's iron filings. So these iron-enhanced sand features can actually retain more of these nutrients and keep them from moving on downstream to these impaired water bodies. I think in this case it was Coleman Lake, which is an impaired natural water body. So upstream of that, they're trying to take in as much of these nutrients that are having issues downstream. So here's just some specs around that if you're interested, want to get all nerdy there. But that's what the iron filings that you kind of mix in with this sand in the middle of the trench to enhance that nutrient absorption. So there's also some inflow and outflow data from this pond that had been kind of collected over the years. You can kind of see that there's a significant percent reduction in that phosphorus that is taken in by the filtration of that stormwater. So pretty good results with this alternative media. So that's just one example. There's tons of other additions you can add to these basins to have different results depending on your local situation and the stormwater runoff you're dealing with. So it's a case-by-case basis. So before you start going and throwing iron filings into your garden beds and things, there's a little bit more to that in engineering. But it's one solution we can look at. And then our last one I want to touch on is aquifer storage and recovery, or managed aquifer recharge. There's different names for it nowadays, but this was one project for the city of Provo. They had issues with declining groundwater levels in some of their municipal wells. So that was a concern that had started growing with the city. How are we going to fix this? If we keep just pumping water out of our system, how are we going to sustain a growing population that's also experiencing some of these different changes in precipitation and these different trends? So that's where we got to work. So looking at some of these sites that were kind of started, an investigation was kind of taken to look at areas of the aquifer that was already previously mapped and looking at areas that you could potentially infiltrate water back into the aquifer and recharge it. So looking at different kind of categories there that maybe prioritizing these different sites in terms of what the city already owned or what would be most susceptible to infiltration from the surface versus injecting into existing wells that the city owns. So you can actually put water back down in pumped wells, or you can actually infiltrate on the surface. So there's different ways that we were looking at doing this in the beginning, just evaluating a simple feasibility. So it was looking at the direct injection alternatives that were found to be the most feasible. were two to the north of the city, kind of 5600 North and Riverwoods Well. These two existing groundwater wells would be retrofitted to allow for infiltration back down the well in different times of the year when water's more available, excess water is available to put back into the groundwater table. Similarly, we have a surface infiltration feature. This one was at Riverview Park. So here is kind of some of the photos from the piloting phase. So that's where we take just small portions of water and start to test and evaluate what the infiltration is like in this area, and kind of evaluating what the rise in the groundwater table can actually be from these tests. So kind of the early stages of just putting water and piloting is what that's called. So this is some photos from that. And then the second site was up Rock Canyon. I don't know if there's any rock climbers in the audience, if anyone's been out there. Rock Canyon's just, I mean, here's some pictures of it, gorgeous. But existing infrastructure didn't exist to meet the scale of what could deliver water up the canyon to dump into these creek beds. The creek bed itself has a pretty direct connection to the aquifer. So that's what the goal of getting water up that canyon was, and originally testing that to see what the capacity for that riverbed to take in water and infiltrate it back into the aquifer and the groundwater table. So those were some of the original piloting efforts in the early days of the study. And then here's actual results. So in addition to drilling some of the observation wells, different loggers were put in to kind of track how much groundwater was fluctuating over the years. You can actually start to see that when some of these events putting water back in the stream bed, you can see a pretty good little bump up in all these different observation wells, indicating that you are seeing an increase in your groundwater table and additional volume that can be taken out through these municipal wells later down the line. So, you know, some actual good results coming out of these. Some of these projects are still being funded, and some infrastructure is being installed and is being completed now, but additional funding will be required to kind of further these efforts because they're pretty expensive, but it's one way we can kind of keep water in our back pocket for the future. So, you know, in summary, I know that was a lot of information. So we looked at different ways that we can prioritize some of these funding opportunities and projects through these climate change vulnerability assessments. Looking at these vulnerable populations in these communities and taking a look at that. And then actual project examples where we took what we learned from those vulnerability assessments or these studies and putting that into action and with projects that could mitigate some of those risks. So hopefully we can work it out. I'm hopeful that we can, and so staying optimistic there. So if there's any questions, yeah.
Couple of questions about, well, on the two of the cases that you were talking about, one where the water was being released in advance of expected bigger storms.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just being released into the stream and downflow, but you're just doing it in advance of, or where's it going?
Yeah, so there's a downstream system that does connect to like a natural system, a river. So that is in advance of those storms, the system can predict when kind of the rough volume or approximate volume of that storm, looking at the density. And I'm not a meteorologist, so I'm not going to pretend I know how that system fully works. But it kind of associating that with a volume that they can drain down from that reservoir and sending it downstream into the system after it's maybe had a little bit more chance to settle out, and there's some other benefits passed along downstream from the reservoir. Yeah.
So then my other question is on the Provo example, where was water coming from that was being put into the recharge?
Good question. Yeah, so a lot of that water that is pegged for that project actually is city-owned water that they haven't developed. So it's a lot of water rights that aren't previously or haven't been developed for the city of Provo. And there's a little bit more complexity there than that. So if you want to know more, I can probably connect you with the right people. But I think it was city-owned city-owned water that was allocated for that project. And so in times when you have excess water, putting it back in the groundwater table to recharge it instead of letting it just flow downstream, which isn't always the worst case, but in specific cases, maybe it's good to put it in the ground too. So,
Thanks.
yep.
So one question I had was, on the Minnesota, as you were creating the troughs, did you drain the water in there first, all the stagnant water, then was the project dug and refilled with rainwater, or?
Oh, so for the second example of like the Morningside project?
Yeah.
Yes. So I think it was dewatered through like a permitted process. So you have different kind of constraints on. You can't just take that water and necessarily discharge out. It probably needs to be dewatered in like a filtration bag or some other. I wasn't necessarily involved with that portion of the project or the project through its whole cycle, but that's generally how it's done. It's dewatered through like a series of pumps.
I'm interested in the infiltration basin that you showed, which I think was lower in the watershed, like in town, I think. I'm wondering if you were looking at sites to do this, to accomplish the same goal, higher up in the watershed, perhaps more in the canyon. And if so, what attributes are you looking for an optimal infiltration site?
I'll preface this by saying I'm not a hydrogeologist, but I'm an engineer. So like kind of those alluvial fan features, and actually Jeff Davis here is giving a talk about aquifer recharge, so he might have a little bit more insight. He is a hydrogeologist. So go to his talk next. If you want a little bit more information, you might have it. But some of those kind of like vado zones where it can easily infiltrate into the aquifer, and a lot more times upstream, kind of these alluvial fans. It's where you're going to find it is kind of some of these canyon bodies. But talk to Jeff. He's going to know more about it. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. If you have any more questions, reach out to me. We have a booth set up, and I'm happy to answer your questions.